or so. He worked for 25 years at IBM and is the author of what is perhaps one of the most widely read security self-assessment documents in the history of the world. It's called the Orange Card, is that right? He has provided his expertise to many companies. He currently works for Deloitte and Touche and brings to us a different perspective on security from the business side of the world rather than from the military side. And I think that is particularly important. The topic of his talk today is everything I learned about computer security, I learned in the Tower of London. Everything I know I learned in the Tower of London. And he's just recently come back from Europe and visited the tower. And so, without ado, I will introduce Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Cynthia. Do you remember where you were on eBay Yahoo Day? When we had the denial of service attacks? And they sort of demonstrated to us that the internet, while it is extraordinarily reliable, is not terribly robust. That a script kiddie operating all by himself can bring down two of the biggest and three of the biggest systems in the e-commerce world. And if you had on Wednesday of that week bought security and sold the internet, you would have made a pot full of money. How many of you remember when the Tylenol got contaminated with cyanide? And of course, the motive there was to move the stock price of Johnson & Johnson. And that's how the guy got caught. He had entered orders with about 30 different stockbrokers to sell puts or to buy puts on Johnson & Johnson. And he went in to Merrill Lynch one day to withdraw some money that he had made in that transaction, and the FBI was waiting there to arrest him. It was relatively easy in that situation to find somebody who bought puts on Johnson & Johnson. And when the same name appeared on the books of 3 or 4 different brokerage houses, they were pretty sure that they had the right guy. In the case of selling the internet, you're selling a whole basket of stocks. And it's not quite so obvious that you have done it. What you have to find is somebody who sold lots of the internet that day and also bought lots and lots and lots of security stocks on that day. Some of the security stocks, Entrust and VeriSign, moved about 10 or 12 points that day, in large part in response to what happened. And there was a fundamental flaw in what we were doing that contributed to that whole problem. About 15 years ago, correct me, Cynthia, if you get the timing better, NSA noticed that the Soviet embassy in Washington bristled with antennae. And they decided to find out what it was the Russians were listening in on. And what they were listening on was terrestrial microwave that was carrying telephone calls. And what they were doing was they were listening for call setup information going across the network that had in it the telephone number of the White House, the Pentagon, Domino's Pizza in Arlington, Virginia, and a little dairy down in Norfolk, Virginia, that supplied milk to the aircraft carrier that was stationed in Norfolk. Every time the aircraft carrier was going to sortie, the little dairy got all kinds of telephone calls from the Pentagon talking about milk. NSA looked at that for a while, and they finally went to the telcos and they said, hey, telcos, you know, it's really not good practice for you to put the telephone calls right behind the call setup information in the same channel. Nice people don't do that. All the Russians have to do is camp on that circuit, listen for the White House telephone number to go by, and then record all the traffic that follows that telephone number. They said, you're getting ready to implement this wonderful new signaling system called Signaling System 7. And when you implement Signaling System 7, it would be a nice idea if you put the call setup information in one channel and the related telephone call in another channel. Now somebody listening in the middle can't associate those two things. They can hear both of them go by in the channel, they just can't associate one with the other because they're in two different channels. And the telco said, oh, okay, that's not a big deal. We can do that. And so in implementing Signaling System 7 for the dial system, that's what they did. They put call setup in one channel and they put the traffic in another channel. About that time, the telcos were discovering packet switching. Some of you may be aware that in the early days of the internet developers went to AT&T and asked them for help in creating the internet. And the AT&T people said, packet switching will never work, and we're not going to help you. Well, shortly after they did Signaling System 7, the telcos reinvented packet switching. And they said, this packet switching is wonderful stuff. We can put it behind the wall where the customer can't see it. It will help us use our circuits much more efficiently, but we'll still be able to sell virtual circuits to the customer based upon time, distance, and bandwidth, just like we always have. And it will take us a lot less capability to deliver those services, and we're going to put the difference in our pockets as profits. And so they said, on the backbone, we are going to reinvent packet switching. And they did. Guess what? In the process, they put signaling back in band. So that a little script kiddie in Worcester, Massachusetts was able to bring down the switch at his local telephone company, and with it, the local airport and the local FAA office, all by himself. Because the ability to send a telephone call through that switch included the ability to log on to the switch. The switch was listening for logons to its operating system on exactly the same network interface cards as it was listening for its traffic. Nice people don't do that. Only in information technology do we do that. In no other infrastructure technology that we have do we put the controls intended only for management right next to the controls intended for the user. It's the moral equivalent of taking the master circuit breaker for the campus and remoting a copy of it next to every light switch. It's the moral equivalent of taking the joystick for the autopilot on the 747 and replicating it between every two passenger seats. Nice people don't do that. But that's the way we are operating our infrastructure. And so if you were eBay or Yahoo on that day, your Cisco routers were set up in such a way that they were listening for ICMP packets on exactly the same network interface cards as they were carrying all the traffic from the internet to the web servers. Nice people don't do that. Now, what did they save by doing that? Well, they saved one additional card in the router. That's all. They say, those cards are expensive. I say, well, I don't really know. Anybody here know the current street price for an Ethernet card? $60? Do I have a lower number? 30, 20? The last one I bought I paid 18, 16 probably sounds about right. Now, admittedly, theirs was not an Ethernet card, and it wasn't going to go into a PC. It was going to be a little bit more expensive than that. Maybe it would have cost hundreds of dollars. But think of how much money it might have saved. And part of their excuse was, it says, the RFC for ping says that when you get one, you're obligated to acknowledge it. And then wait. And so they were getting flooded with all this ICMP traffic, and they were dedicating resources to it, and pretty soon the operating system slowed down, and in some cases they fell over altogether, and we have huge service outages. But not only that, we have a huge loss of public trust and confidence in the internet. And the motive to do it was probably not even money. The guys who did it probably didn't make a dime off of it, although it moved the markets dramatically, and there was all kinds of opportunity for people to make money on it. In fact, I happened to make money on it because I'm sort of overweighted in security stocks. And I did in fact make money on it that day. So it moved the markets. Well, anything that moves the markets, there's a motive for people to do it. So we are operating in ways that are inherently dangerous. We are operating in ways that nice people don't do. One of the unique things about the internet is that the users participate with the operators and providers of the internet almost as peers. We have no other infrastructure that we operate that way. We have no other infrastructure that where we put the controls intended for the managers right next to the controls intended for the users. In the electrical system, we don't do that. In the railroad system, we don't do that. In airplanes, we don't do that. Now, infrastructure is built to a different set of standards than we have been building information technology for the last 25 years. Infrastructure, by design and intent, does not fall down of its own weight. Bridges, tunnels, dams, skyscrapers don't fall down of their own weight. When Henry Kaiser built the Hoover Dam, his vision was that when the pyramids crumbled, the dam was still going to be there. You know what? Nobody quibbled with Henry over the cost of the last 1,000 years of the dam. That's just the way you build dams. It is very dangerous to people living downstream of dams to build them any other way. Bridges do not fall of their own weight, and when they do, and there have been a number in history that have, right? There was the Firth of Tay Bridge a little more than 100 years ago, and then there was Galloping Gertie, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Every child in our culture grows up with images in their head of that bridge doing this until it finally fell down. Now notice some things about Gertie. Gertie was built with the best materials that were available. Gertie was a well-fabricated bridge. The Firth of Tay Bridge fell down because one engineer designed it and another engineer built it. And into that gap fell all kinds of things. The engineer who designed it had all kinds of ideas that he was carrying around in his head that he forgot to write down, like the modern programmer. And as a consequence, the bridge fell down. Well, Gertie didn't suffer from that. Gertie was built of the right materials. She was well fabricated. There was just one little problem. And that was Gertie was poorly designed. So you're beginning to get part of the list of why systems fail. Systems fail because they are poorly designed. Systems fail because they are poorly fabricated. Systems fail because they are poorly put together. They fail because the materials themselves, they fail because they are improperly maintained, and they failed because they are improperly operated. Now, in the internet, we have built it for one set of properties, but this is one of those instances where we are running the business with the prototype. The internet started as a prototype, and it just grew. We are suffering today from its successes and from its limitations. So we have to step back now and fundamentally rethink what it is that we are doing when we build infrastructure. One other interesting property of the internet is that what we've done is we wake up now and we realize that we are using our most novel and our most fragile infrastructure to operate and coordinate all of the others. So when a part of the internet fails, public power distribution may fail, public transport may fail. Not the same problem. Now, as Cynthia said, I just came back from London. In London, they have big red buses. And out in the countryside, they have little buses in England. And when the little bus driver comes to London, what he does is he gets on the big red bus. And he rides around London on the big red bus. That's called the busman's holiday. When security people go to London, they go to the Tower of London, because there are all kinds of lessons for security people in the Tower of London. And so every time I go to London, I take my compulsory trip to the Tower. And I learn all kinds of important things that security people need to know in order to be able to do their jobs in the proper way. The tower, the central part that you see there with the four turrets, was built by William the Conqueror sometime shortly after the Battle of Hastings. And it's a wonderful, marvelous structure. You notice now that it has large windows in it, but at the time it didn't have those large windows. At the time, the threat was that the Saxons were really good at using the bow and arrow. And the Normans were very concerned about the accuracy of the Saxons with the bows and arrows. So what they did was they built all the windows in the tower as very narrow slits, on the theory that it's relatively easy to shoot a bow out of that narrow slit, and it's very difficult to shoot one in. So the tower gave great protection from the threat of the day, the longbow. Well, it turns out that over time, somebody came to the tower with a catapult, able to throw large rocks at the tower, and the little slits didn't protect very well against large rocks. So they built the second wall outside the tower itself. Now the whole complex is now called the tower, and the little thing in the middle is called the keep. So they built the second wall. That kept people with catapults far enough away that they weren't able to knock down the keep. After some great period of time, they built, a couple hundred years went by. The whole complex was actually built over about a 300 or 400 period, 300 or 400 year period. Right here is the moat. The moat, when it was full of water, was 120 feet wide, and it was 15 feet deep. And if you got across the moat, you were confronted with the inner wall and you still were going to have to get over it, and you were going to have to get over it from little boats. And there were people standing up on the walls dropping rocks into your boat, which made it kind of difficult to scale the walls while they were throwing rocks into your boat. So the lesson is that as your enemy becomes more and more capable, you push your perimeter defenses outward. First you build the inner wall, and then you build the outer wall, and then you build the moat. Notice that getting over or under or through the outer wall only confronts you with another wall. And if you get through that one, you still got to get into the keep in order to be able to take over the tower. So over a 1,000-year period, as the enemy has become more and more capable, they have kept pushing the defenses of the tower out. Now, the modern mission of the tower, for roughly the last 400 years, one of the things that the tower does is the tower is the place where the crown jewels of England are stored. Not the crown jewels of England, the crown jewels of Britain. England, Scotland, and Wales are all stored in the blockhouse next to the keep. When I was over there last week, there was an honor guard outside the blockhouse made up of Australian soldiers. That morning, I had gone to the Buckingham Palace to see the Queen. She was not into me, but she had a changing of the guard, and there was an Australian band who played for the changing of the guard, and when they retreated, they played Waltzing Matilda. And it was really quite a fun day. And the same guards, when we got over to the tower, the same guards were at the tower, standing guard over the blockhouse where the crown jewels are stored. Now, in the 60s, the English and the British were very concerned about atomic attack. And they visualized that there might be an atomic bomb dropped on London and the crown jewels would be damaged. In addition to that, they were worried about terrorists. And so they put the crown jewels in the blockhouse. In the center of the blockhouse, they dug a deep pit. They had a very long spiral staircase that went down to the pit. And if you wanted to see the crown of St. Edward, you had to go down this very, very, very long spiral ramp. If you wanted to take it out, you were going to have to go back up that ramp. And it was going to take you a while. When you stood in line to watch stood in line to go see the crown, there was a sign that hung over it. It said, "Be on notice. If the alarms are activated, all the doors and shutters are going to slam shut, and you may be trapped in here for several hours. If that makes you uncomfortable, you better get out of line now." I thought, by God, they read my book. Wonderful. Because you see, one of the things we do to keep people from stealing the crown jewels is we put them behind multiple perimeters. The moat, the outer wall, the inner wall, the blockhouse, down the spiral staircase. We also make it very difficult for them to get out with it, should they. Now, it turns out the last time the crown jewels were stolen was about 300 or 400 years ago. It's working. But not sufficient to protect it from atomic attack. So underneath the little perimeter, there's a last perimeter is, when you get to the crown of St. Edward, there's a big quartz crystal glass in front of it that you have to look through to see it. When you're standing on the little ramp, you can't quite reach over and touch it. And there is nobody else in there. Nothing in there but the crown. If the alarms for atomic attack go off, the crown drops another 200 feet under the ground, and concrete doors close over it. Notice, you push your perimeters out, you bring the crown jewels in, and you push them down, and you create multiple perimeters. For the last 20 years, we have gone from a very highly structured, circuit-switched, connection-oriented, point-to-point network to an almost perfectly flat packet-switched network. And the problem with perfectly flat networks is that while they may provide very good connectivity and great bandwidth, you can't say anything about their security. So about 7 or 8 years ago, we invented this, well, we borrowed this idea from the Tower of London and from all kinds of other buildings, the idea of the firewall. And they said, we better put a perimeter outside our computer room. And we injected firewalls in between and added structure to the network, right? Now we have a two-layer network. We have the public network and we have the private network. Except, of course, DoD, although they don't think of it in these terms, has always said, oh, we have the third network. We have the command and control network. And it's separate from the internet. Well, almost separate. Yes, there are machines that are connected to both of them. Sometimes that can be okay, as long as those machines are configured as firewalls. So, we have at the corners of the here's the blockhouse back here. This is called Trader's Gate. It fronts on the river. It's called that because if you were going to be beheaded, they took you into the tower through here. The scaffold was up here. There was one big scaffold up here on this hill that they used for public executions. That was the English equivalent of the Roman circus. And there were picnics and bands played and flags waved when they executed traitors up here. If you were the king's wife and you were to be executed, you got executed in, or even a close intimate, you got executed in here. And the crown jewels were kept back here. Now, my friend Marcus Ranum likes to say a firewall is an expensive way to slow down your traffic. Marcus Ranum is the guy who built the TIS toolkit with which we implemented many of the early firewalls and which was the model for the Gauntlet firewall. And Marcus now says a firewall is an expensive way to slow down your traffic. Doesn't sound as though he has very much confidence in them, does he? And the problem that Marcus highlights there is the problem of, I'll come back to this. It's the problem of the tunnel. Notice that one of the ways to attack the tower is with a tunnel. Instead of trying to go over the walls, we go under the walls. And we can do that a little bit more covertly, right? So, historically, going all the way back to Roman times, Caesar used to undermine the walls of a city by digging a tunnel underneath. Going back further than that, we have the Greek attack on Troy, from which we get the attack named the Trojan horse attack. The tunnel can originate on either side, and the tunnel in real space requires a lot of time to dig. And when you come up, you have a very narrow opening down which the defenders can pour hot oil, very uncomfortable hot oil. or even worse, hot tar, because it sticks. And so the tunnel, in the real world, the tunnel is a very expensive approach, and it still doesn't enable you to mount an attack in force against the defenders of the system. However, in virtual space, the tunnel is a little bit easier. Best illustrated probably by the story of my friend who posted a note to one of the forums that I monitor, where he said, you know, my users are consuming a very large portion of my connection to the internet, watching streaming audio, video and listening to streaming audio. What can I do about that? And somebody said, well, why don't you shut down the ports for streaming audio and streaming video? He says, I did that. Now they are using a tunnel through the HTTP ports. It turns out that building virtual tunnels is a lot cheaper than digging under the wall, and you can mount an attack in force. You can use a very large bandwidth coming through the firewall. Now, what had happened was, while he was blocking streaming audio and streaming video, lots of other system and firewall managers were blocking streaming audio and streaming video, and the real audio people said, we can't get our services through the firewalls to the users. So right next to the streaming audio and streaming video server, where they were going to send the streaming audio and the streaming video in some kind of a very nice broadcast protocol, they put up another server which carried the same content encapsulated inside HTTP. Well, what's the problem with putting that server there? What's the limitation with putting the server there that's going to be able to tunnel streaming audio and streaming video in the HTTP protocol? You have to have a client on the inside of the firewall that's ready to talk to you in that protocol. Well, now, if you're real audio and you would like to get a client inside my firewall, how do you go about doing that? You're going to give it away, right? You're going to make it free. So the users are going to say, well, I've got no price impediment to doing it. But how are they going to get it? They're going to download it. All you have to do is, all over the internet, you spread streaming audio and streaming video objects. And when somebody clicks on one of those objects, you say, would you like to get the latest version of real audio or real video? If so, click here. And of course, lots of people click there, right? What's the lesson? Well, the lesson is that perimeter defenses don't work very well if the adversary has agents, sympathizers, or even dupes on the inside. If you are tunneling under the wall of the Tower of London, it would be nice to have somebody on the inside who's tunneling out to meet you, right? It would be nice if there was somebody there who was going to put up something to conceal the inside part of the tunnel from the defenders, so they can't pour hot oil or hot tar down it. Perimeter defenses don't work very well when there are sympathizers inside the perimeter. And of course, in the modern network, on the private side of the firewall, The adversary, oh well, you can't really say real audio and real video is the adversary, right? I mean, they're nice people and all they're really trying to do is sell a little advertising. And they're going to give you this wonderful music and these wonderful movies. They're not bad guys. So if the other end of the tunnel is hooked to a real audio server, that's not so bad. And of course, that's what all the users think, right? Well, now let's suppose that what you want to do is that you want to get a copy of back orifice inside my firewall. How do you do that? You say, click here to download a copy of Real Player. Except, of course, this isn't Real Player. This is back orifice. Well, maybe it is Real Player. If I were going to do it, I wouldn't want you to notice that you didn't get Real Player. So I would take a copy of Real Player and a copy of back orifice. I would package them together under one install program, and I would say, click here to get Real Player. And when you clicked, not only would you install Real Player, but you would install back orifice. Now, if I've got a copy of back orifice behind your firewall, and I own the other end of the tunnel to back orifice, I own you. So perimeter fences don't really work very well when you've got adversaries behind the perimeter, okay? And what's the lesson of the tower? The lesson of the tower says, I have multiple perimeters. And inside the perimeter, where the crown jewels are stored, inside where the crown of St. Edward is, there are no people. So I'm going to have concentric defenses. Getting a Real Player on the private network may be useful. Getting a copy of back orifice on the private network may be useful, but it need not be sufficient for getting at the crown jewels. I want the crown jewels to be behind another perimeter, okay? And inside the strong room, I don't want anybody. So in the room where we are putting our root key servers for our public key infrastructures, nobody works in there. And it takes two people to get access there. And of course, in the room in Los Alamos, where we keep the hard drives with all the nuclear secrets, okay, we don't have anybody in that room, right? And it requires two people to get into that room, right? Right?
Yeah. Every day. Except for dinner.
I remember one time we had a briefing in IBM White Plains for the CIA. And we asked them what the average occupancy of their computer room was. And they said, oh, about 40 people per shift. We said, well, you know, to us that seems to be a little bit high. They said, well, not to worry. They all have top secret clearances. We said, if the average occupancy of the room is 40 people, you cannot say anything with confidence about the clearances or the credentials of those people, because you can't notice the 41st person. Not a chance that you're going to notice the 41st person. So if we want security, we have to take out people. We got to have a very, very limited number of people who are privileged to go into the strong room where the nuclear secrets are kept. We got to have a very limited number of people who are privileged to go into the room where the root key machine, the root key server is kept. And we have to ensure that when they go in pairs. And that the same pair that went in this week can't go in next week, because they might be in collusion or cooperation or collaboration. Now, these are fundamental things that we learned at the Tower of London. We didn't have to wait until the computer came along to figure all of this out. We've known it all along. It's just that we often forget it, and we often forget to apply it. Nobody inside the strong room. But even if I have structured my system this way, it's important that there be people on the walls. If you don't man the walls, the attackers have all kinds of time in which to carry out their attack. If they can work outside the walls, get up really close to start the tunnel, and they got lots of time without any observation to dig underneath it, they're going to get under it. We got called in one time to do a review of a firewall. Belonged to a big security company. Some of you may even have heard of this security company, but they're clients. I'm not going to tell you who they were. But one of the things we did was we looked at their firewall. And now they're a security company. They can't afford to have their name in the newspaper says their firewall has been breached. And so the rules for the firewall were really rather stringent. And there wasn't very much traffic that was permitted through the firewalls. But there was one rule missing. There was the rule that said log all the traffic that you refused to let through the firewall. And they say, well, we're not going to let it through. Why do we have to have a rule for it? Why do we have to log it? After all, that takes up storage space. And storage space, as cheap as it may be, is finite. How cheap is storage space these days? The first megabyte of storage that I ever saw was the size of 2 refrigerators and cost tens of thousands of dollars. Today, we no longer measure storage in megabytes, do we? We now measure it in gigabytes. In my laptop, I have 6 gigabytes. If I were to replace that laptop today for exactly the same price that I paid for this one, I would get 75 gigabytes. And I expect that next year when I really do replace it, I replace it when the disk drive fills up. I don't try to recover anything from the disk drive that fills up. I don't try to install a new, none of that stuff. I just replace the machine when the disk drive fills up. But I'll get 100, 125, 150 gigabytes of storage. 2 months ago, I was at Computer World in New Orleans. They had a machine that was about the size of this, but it stood about this high. It had 10 terabytes of data in it, a box that size. But we're still conserving it like it was expensive. And we say, oh, it's too expensive for us to log traffic. I have a firewall on my machine. I log all the traffic. I have the logs since the day one. Every now and then I take the log out and I sort it and I look at it. In other words, I am manning the walls. Because you see, even on an electronic firewall, a logical firewall, if somebody is able to stand on the outside and pound at it long enough, he will get through. How will he get through? Well, one of the things he might try to do is to log onto the operating system of the firewall. And you say, oh, well, but he's got to guess the password. And I say, right. Or he's got to brute force the password, right? How hard is that? Well, it may be very hard. But if he can send traffic at it long enough, by definition, he's going to get through. What we want to be in a position to do is to take timely and appropriate corrective action. The sooner we notice that we are under attack, the more effective our defenses are going to be. It's sort of like The 747. The specification for a 747 says that in a straight and level airspeed of straight and level attitude, airspeed of 550 knots, controls in a neutral position, the 747 can be expected to fly. Of course, that's not a complete specification, is it? The specification goes on to say that at some critical angle, which is a function of airspeed and control setting, the 747 can be expected to stop flying. Not an adequate specification. The specification goes on one more level to say, what evidence will the 747 present that it has stopped flying so that the captain is in a position to take timely and appropriate corrective action? In this case, what's timely is fairly obvious. Timely is sometime before rather than after the 747 hits the ground. A few years ago, I lived in Dallas. Dallas in those days was domiciled to two large airlines, one of which has since gone out of business. Now, it used to be that in order to go out of business, to go bankrupt, all you really needed was a lawyer. Not true anymore. In order to go out of business today, you have to have lawyers and investment bankers and security people and public relations people. Just to go out of business, you have to have public relations people. The public relations people for the failed airline said, we were driven out of business by the connection between our computer and our competitor's computer. They used it to drive us out of business. I say, if your computer is hooked to your neighbor's computer, then you better have a very rigorous expectation of exactly how your neighbor's computer is going to behave. And you better be able to recognize a variance from that behavior on a timely basis. Timely in this case being sometime before rather than after you go bankrupt. Okay? In our case, timely is before the penetration succeeds. So every day the alarms go off on my system and I stand on the wall and I look down and I say, who's down there and what are they doing? Well, in 99.9999% of the cases on my system, somebody went by and rattled a window or rattled a door or banged on a port to see whether or not it was open. And when they found that it wasn't open, they went on. I say, those are script kiddies looking for soft targets. Now, it is alarming how often the soft targets happen to be connected to government networks. Because every one of those public-facing targets that's hooked to the government network becomes a sally port or a tunnel potentially through the firewall, through the defensive perimeter. So it's important that we're looking down from the wall to see who's out there, to see what they are doing, see whether they are banging on things, see whether they are small children or large armies. We don't care if merchants are going up and down, marching up and down outside the gate. No big problem. We don't want cannons. We don't want rams. We don't want catapults dragged up outside the gate without anybody noticing. We want to notice in a timely way so that we can throw down hot tar and burning oil on the potential attackers. Everything we needed to know, we learned at the Tower of London. The height of the walls ought to be uniform. There is a terrible tendency every now and then to hear about a new threat. We call those dragons. New threat, a dragon, and we're going to raise the walls to defend against the dragons. Now, dragons have a wonderful property. Dragons do not exist. But every now and then, people become alarmed about dragons, and they go and they try to raise the walls. How high should the walls be? Well, how high do the walls have to be in order to protect against dragons? Since dragons don't exist, they don't have to be very high. How high do we want to make the walls? We want to make the walls high enough to protect us from bears and brigands. Because bears and brigands do exist. And we know exactly how high the walls have to be in order to protect against bears and brigands. If you get across the moat to the outer wall, it's 29 feet from the water to the top of the wall. That's good enough for all bears and brigands. And dragons don't exist. Everything we need to know, we learned at the Tower of London. Okay? Huh?
Dragons can fly.
Dragons can fly. The soothsayer tells us that the dragons can fly, right? They're going to fly right on the wall. It doesn't make any difference. If dragons existed, it wouldn't make any difference how high the walls were, because dragons are going to fly over the walls. Fortunately for us, the dragons don't exist. But if we believe in dragons, we might be tempted to do silly things. It's important that we understand the power of our adversaries. I have to do one thing to protect myself against script kiddies. They exist. I have to do another thing to protect myself against people who are going to do a denial of service attack for commercial gain. And I have to do yet another if what I want to do is protect myself against a nation state. Now, in commerce, we don't worry about nation states. For us, they belong in the same category as dragons. But if you are part of the Department of Defense, or even just the United States Navy or Marine Corps, you have to worry about nation states. What you don't want to do is to overreact to script kiddies and behave as though you are under attack from a nation state, as happened a couple of years ago. The Air Force was mounting an operation against Iran. And while that operation was going on, some script kiddies attacked a domain name server. Domain name servers trust one another. So domain name servers all over the Air Force began to topple over. The people manning the walls looked down and they said, "It's misty down there, we can't see. Wonder where the traffic is coming from." They looked at the traffic and they decided that the traffic was coming from an internet service provider in Iran. What a coincidence. They were 1 hour from launching the bomber against that internet service provider when cooler heads prevailed. 1 hour to protect themselves against 3 script kiddies, 2 16-year-olds in California and 1 18-year-old in Israel, which is how they happened to meet in Iran and come to the internet service provider in Iran. Very important that we know whether we're dealing with bears and brigands or dragons. Very important that we know whether we are dealing with script kiddies or whether we are dealing with nation states. Now, what I've suggested to you so far is that in our perimeter, we've only got one perimeter of defense. We've got the whole world out there. We've got a firewall or a bastion up there. I told you we'd go back to the bastions, didn't I? There are the bastions. The bastions have interesting properties. In the bastions, there may be sally ports that enable us to send people outside the walls to gather intelligence, to get food, to do all kinds of things. But the bastions have are constructed in such a way that if the door on the outside of the bastion is open, the door on the inside of the bastion is closed, and in any case the doors are very small. As compared to the gate over here, or the gate over here, through which provisions normally move, and those tend to be rather large. The ones in the bastions are very small. And they're constructed in, the bastion is characterized by the fact that it protrudes into the hostile space. And it may have openings into the hostile space and openings into the inside. And of course, we have the logical equivalent of a bastion. In computer science, it's a system with 2 or more network interface cards. 2 or more. One is the door to the inside, and one is the door to the outside. And nice people do not route traffic between those 2 cards. So the bastion can be a very powerful mechanism for helping us to maintain the integrity, very different from a plain old ordinary firewall, right? The plain old ordinary firewall is the one that the guy is routing the tunnel through. Incidentally, if you want to know how to build a tunnel from inside the firewall in the government to your home computer, there's a description on the internet about how to do that. Incidentally, you don't use the HTTP port. You use the SSL port. And you can build a VPN through the firewall back to your home computer. Wonderful, right? But of course, that's because you're trusted and privileged. We wouldn't want every ordinary, everyday seaman, for example, building tunnels back to his home computer. Well, his home computer would be okay. Their home computers begins to be a problem. So it's important that we have mechanisms in place to enable us to resist that, right? The bastion resists and regulates the flow of traffic between the networks in accordance with policy. Who states the policy? The defenders do. But sometimes, you know, you have firewalls between you and other good guys, right? We have allies. We have the UK, very friendly. We have Canada. We have Mexico. We have Australia. We have France. So we want to regulate the traffic in accordance with our policies. One of the things that you will see is you will see nation states confronting each other, firewall to firewall, implementing 2 complementary policies to resist flow between the 2 networks. What kind of flow do you want to resist? You want to resist hostile attack traffic, right? How do you recognize hostile attack traffic? With some difficulty. It often looks very much like other traffic. HTTP that's encapsulating streaming audio and streaming video looks just like any other HTTP. That's why we use that port, right? Because everybody's got the HTTP port on the firewall open. And I say, no, not on my system. In my system, I put a bastion there. And I take the HTTP page off the public network and I decode it into a page. And before I put it on the inside network, I re-encode it back into HTTP. I don't simply route the HTTP protocol through a firewall. I take it through a bastion where I'm going to decode it and examine it into an... Notice, when I look at HTTP coming through the firewall, I can't tell whether there's streaming audio or streaming video inside it unless I decode it from HTTP And then I can see the streaming audio and the streaming video. But if all I do is just route it through, I'm not going to be able to tell what's in there. I can't tell whether it's streaming audio and streaming video or whether it's a copy of back orifice. I can recognize back orifice if I see it, but I have to have decoded it into an executable before I'm going to be able to see it. I cannot recognize it as it goes through the firewall in packets. And so for that purpose, I need a true bastion. I'm going to suggest to you that what we really need to do at this point is we need to organize our network into more layers than we currently have. How many? Well, I'm going to argue for at least 4. And we're going to talk about each one of them. Now, 4 may be adequate, but notice for the crown jewels, we have the moat, we have the inner wall, the outer wall, the inner wall, the blockhouse wall, and inside we have the strong room wall. We don't have 5 layers throughout the whole Tower of London. Only for the crown jewels. So we want to structure and compartment our system into layers. And what are the properties of these layers? Well, layers are divided by firewalls, or by bastions more likely, okay? And they have a number of interesting characteristics. Any machine that's connected to 2 networks becomes part of the perimeter defense between those 2 networks. Now, we think of it as a firewall, right? Where do you get firewalls?
You download them from the net.
You download them from the net. They're just software, right? You instantiate the software in a box and you've got a firewall. Wrong. That's a gate. It's a simple gate. It's not a bastion. We have to compose firewalls. Firewalls, Marcus Ranum, when he made his comment about a firewall as an expensive way to slow down your traffic, was talking about a commercial, off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box firewall. A product. Firewalls are not products. You can't buy them. Firewalls have to be built. You can't buy one. Now, you can buy Checkpoint 1 and Gauntlet and all of those products, and they are useful, but they're not firewalls. They are components that we are going to use to build firewalls. And any machine that connects 2 layers is part of the perimeter between those 2 layers. Most machines are going to be connected to 2 or more layers. And I'm going to show you why. And therefore the machines have to mediate, and indeed, for the most part, they have to block traffic from flowing from one of their network connections to their other network connection. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. A communication card, a machine may be connected to 2 networks, a NIC may not. A NIC may only be connected to 1 network. Now, that's contrary to our common practice. Our common practice is we don't break the wire physically, we just break it logically. Why? Because the hardware people think NICs are expensive. Don't want to do that. Communication card can only be connected to network. And we might even put choke routers between the networks. Okay? This diagram shows 4 networks, 1 color for each of the networks. Green represents the public network. This is pretty much what you think of the internet, but it may also be the public dial switched network. Logically, those 2 things are separate, or at least separable, Physically, however, they're pretty much the same network, okay? Blue represents the private user network. This is the network on which users log on to applications and log on to servers. Now, that's all, right? Today, that's all the networks there are. But in my diagram, I've got two more. I've got the trusted network. This is the network on which application servers talk to one another, or on which user systems may connect to authentication servers. These networks may be logically separated using secret codes, or they may be physically separated using different pieces of wire. And finally, I have the operator network. This is the network on which the operator operates the servers, or maybe even operates the workstations, right? And in my diagram, it's probably a separate piece of... Now, the public layer offers us any-to-any connectivity. It is mixed point-to-point and broadcast. It's not reliable. We've said all of it today. We have to assume that it's hostile. And only applications that can protect themselves from their traffic... Well, in fact, it turns out the rule must be only things which can protect themselves from all of the traffic that they are likely to see on a network may be connected to that network. Since the most hostile traffic is on the public network, the only things that can be attached to the public network are the strongest of our systems. The weak systems we can put in the strong room. But the things that are going to be attached to the public network have to be the strongest things that there are. Notice, we don't have any operating systems like that. We don't have any operating systems that are sufficiently robust and strong to be attached to the public network. Nice people do not connect operating systems to the public network. And in the denial of service attacks against eBay and Yahoo, we saw the consequences of doing that. Weak systems all over the network were penetrated and then used in a coordinated attack against Yahoo and eBay. Nice people do not attach weak systems to the public network. Weak systems have to be hidden way behind the system. And if we've got sensitive applications like business applications or command and control applications, and they involve the use of that public network, then they have to be done in secret codes. Cannot be done in public codes. Sensitive applications cannot be done in public codes across. Now, the private application layer, this is the layer we've always thought about as the private application, as the private network, right? It's the layer on which it's increasingly hostile. I've got one client who has 600,000 users on the private network. Cynthia can't remember when the internet was only that size, but I can. And we already thought of it as being a hostile place. 600,000 users on the private network, okay? And so it is not really trustworthy either. It's not hostile, but we can't trust it. The trusted system layer is the new layer. We've got to carve it out of the private network. And only trusted system to trusted system traffic flows on this network. There is no user traffic on this network. Users can't log on to one another on this network. Kerberos, authentication protocols, SQL run on this network. But users do not log on this network. And for performance reasons, we normally are going to think of the connections between the systems on here as static and stable. We're not making TCP/IP connections and breaking them down all the time. Instead, we're running secure IP or LU62. The collection of things connected here make up the virtual mainframe. So this is sort of the layer that was internal to the mainframe, in which applications and services inside the mainframe talked to one another. Well, this layer is that layer, except now we have separate pieces of hardware. Notice, no user traffic can flow on here, no control traffic can flow on this network. You can't log on to the operating system on this network. Why? Because we want to be sure that if something on this layer falls over, it doesn't lower the cost of attack against any other thing on this network. So if it falls over, it dies. It can't be co-opted and used against other things. The control layer is also new. This is the layer now on which operators are going to talk to systems. Privileged commands, operating system, logons to the operating system can only occur on this layer. They cannot occur on the system-to-system layer. They cannot occur on the private layer. They cannot occur on the public layer. Only on this layer can privileged commands flow. And operating systems attach only to this layer. No system-to-system traffic. We can do it either with trusted systems, star-wired, through switches even, or we can do it with SSH encryption. I'm missing a diagram, so I'll go back to this one over here. Notice, this machine right here has 4 cards in it and 4 attachments because it's attached to all the layers. Notice that here we have a switch. What the switch does is protect us in such a way that operators can send commands from their system to the server, from here to here, but you can't send a command from here to here because the switch doesn't permit it. And so even if one of these systems were to be compromised and fall over, it wouldn't lower the cost of attack against any of the other systems. Just like at the tower, right? You may attack one compartment, you may take over one bastion, but that doesn't make the whole complex come down. So, recommendations. The tower says you modularize and you compartment. You layer your defenses. You put up multiple perimeters. Breaking through a single perimeter should not be sufficient to take over the whole town, the whole village, the whole fort. As the capabilities of your adversaries grow, keep pushing your defenses out. As the capabilities of your adversaries grow, keep sucking the crown jewels in. Compartment and layer. And so when you get to the strong room, there's nobody on the inside to help somebody dig a tunnel through that last perimeter. Use materials only with respect to their limitations. We have very, 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 very few trusted operating systems. And the trusted operating systems that we have are achieved by taking all kinds of functionality out of the operating systems. Microsoft sells 2,000 for $200 a copy. The government gets it for a lot less than that. They are able to do that by creating an operating system that has an infinite number of uses and almost an infinite number of servers and capabilities. And the combinations of all of those things are such that it makes it almost impossible to test. The room in which Microsoft tests modems has got 400 modems in it. And the room in which they test printers has got 600 printers. Now think about the combinations of printers and modems. We're simply not going to test all of those combinations. Most of the code that you get with 2000 you will never ever use because it supports devices that you don't have and are not likely to ever have. So we know that modern operating systems have terrible limitations that make them inappropriate for most of the things that we want to do with them. But we can use them provided that we are willing to reduce their complexity. What's that mean? It says, well, one of the things I want to do is I want to hide the controls. So if I've got a system that's running on the public network and serving up web pages, I do not want the controls for that system to be visible.